Everybody like and subscribe, praise the bell icon. Story number 1.
It was supposed to be the perfect road trip. Three friends, Jenna, Mark, and Tyler, had planned the getaway for months. They'd mapped out the route, booked a few motels, and were excited to take a week-long drive through the back roads of the country, away from the chaos of their daily lives. But what began as an adventure turned into something much darker, something none of them would ever forget. The trip started off great. They drove for hours, listening to music, laughing, and enjoying the openness of the highway. It was late at night when they reached a small, isolated town. There were no signs of life, just a few flickering streetlights casting eerie shadows on the empty roads. Jenna was driving, and Mark was half asleep in the passenger seat, while Tyler scrolled through his phone in the back. "We should stop at that diner," Mark muttered, his eyes still heavy with sleep. The diner was dimly lit, with a neon sign that buzzed and flickered above it. It seemed like the only place open in miles. Jenna pulled into the parking lot, and the three of them stepped out into the cool night air. The diner looked run down, but they were hungry, and it was the only option. As they walked inside, the doorbell let out a faint jingle. The place was old, with cracked leather booths and dusty windows. There was only one person inside, an older man sitting at the counter, staring into a cup of coffee. The air smelled stale, like it hadn't been cleaned in years. The waitress, a woman in her 50s with deep bags under her eyes, greeted them with a smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. "What can I get you?" she asked in a voice that seemed both tired and strained. They sat down in a booth, trying to ignore the uncomfortable atmosphere. Mark tried to make small talk with the waitress, but she didn't respond much, just offering short answers. Tyler noticed that the old man at the counter hadn't moved, not once. He was still staring into his coffee, as if lost in thought. The food was mediocre at best, but they didn't mind. They were just glad to stretch their legs and take a break from the endless highway. After about 20 minutes, they decided to leave. The waitress stood by the door, her eyes fixed on them as they walked out. As they got back into the car, a strange feeling lingered in the air. It was as though the town itself was watching them, waiting. Mark, trying to shake off the unease, joked about how weird the place felt. Maybe we just need a good night's sleep. But as they drove out of the town, things began to get off. The radio, which had been playing fine for hours, suddenly started to crackle. Static filled the airwaves, and the familiar tunes turned to a garbled mess. Tyler fiddled with the dial, but nothing worked. The road stretched on, but there were no other cars in sight. The dark, empty landscape was beginning to feel endless. They hit a stretch of road that felt strange, too quiet, too isolated. That's when they noticed the figure standing by the side of the road. At first, it looked like a man, hunched over, maybe looking for help. But something about him felt wrong. He was too still, too unnatural. Jenna slowed down, and Mark rolled down the window. "You need help?" he called out, but the figure didn't respond. Not at first. Then slowly the man turned to face them. His eyes were wide, unblinking, and hollow. His face was pale, and his lips curled into a grin that was far too wide to be human. He stepped forward, but not like a person. It was as though he was gliding, his feet not touching the ground properly. Jenna slammed her foot on the gas pedal, and the car sped away, leaving the figure behind. But the feeling of being watched didn't fade. It only grew stronger. Every mile that passed felt heavier, as if something was following them, lurking in the shadows. The next few hours passed in silence, the only sound the hum of the tires on the road. They didn't speak much, too nervous, too unsettled by what they had just seen. The road seemed to go on forever. There was no turning back. Then, without warning, the car sputtered. The engine cut out, and the dashboard lights flickered. Jenna tried to restart the car, but it was dead. In the middle of nowhere, miles away from the nearest town, they were stranded. The three of them sat in the dark, the headlights illuminating nothing but the empty road. The feeling of dread that had been creeping over them was now suffocating. It was then they noticed something even more unsettling. There was no sound, no insects, no wind, just silence. Jenna reached for her phone to call for help, but the signal was gone. Not a single bar. "What the hell is going on?" she whispered, her voice trembling. That's when they heard it, A tapping, soft at first, against the roof of the car. Mark's heart skipped a beat. It wasn't the wind. It wasn't the rain. There was someone or something on top of the car. Tyler quickly looked through the rearview mirror but saw nothing. No one. "We have to go," he said, his voice panicked. "Now." The tapping grew louder, more frantic. It was as though whatever it was on top of the car was getting more desperate. Then, with a jolt, the car lurched forward. The engine roared back to life. Jenna didn't waste any time. She floored the gas pedal, and the car shot down the road at breakneck speed. Behind them, the tapping stopped, replaced by a loud, guttural scream that echoed in the night. They didn't stop driving until they reached the next town, and even then, they couldn't shake the feeling that something had followed them. Something that had been waiting, lurking in the dark, just beyond the reach of their headlights. None of them spoke much about that night again, but it haunted them. Every time they took a road trip after that, they couldn't help but glance nervously at the side of the road, half expecting to see that figure standing there, waiting for them to slow down, to make a mistake. And to this day, none of them have ever driven that stretch of highway again.
Story number 2.
It was supposed to be a weekend getaway, a chance for a group of friends to unwind after a grueling semester of college. Sarah, Kevin, Emily, and Nate had rented a secluded cabin in the woods, far away from the bustle of city life. It seemed like the perfect place to relax, drink, and catch up. The air was crisp, the sky clear, and the quiet of the forest surrounding them was peaceful, at first. They arrived just as the sun was setting, and Sarah, the most organized of the group, immediately started unpacking. The cabin was charming in its own way, rustic with wood beams and large windows that let in a lot of natural light. It had been rented out to vacationers for years, but there was something unsettling about it. The place felt too still, like it had been abandoned for a while. Even with all the modern amenities, the house had a cold, unwelcoming energy. As night fell, they gathered in the living room by the fire, joking and drinking. The wind howled outside, making the trees creak and groan. After a few hours, they began to get sleepy, and one by one, they headed to bed. But something strange happened as Sarah was about to go to sleep. She thought she heard someone whispering her name. It was soft, almost imperceptible, but it sounded like it was coming from right outside her window. She froze, listening intently, but the whisper stopped just as quickly as it had begun. She shook her head, chalking it up to the wind or maybe her imagination, and fell asleep. The next morning, the group went hiking in the woods, exploring the area around the cabin. The forest was dense, the trees towering above them like silent sentinels. They didn't see anyone else on the trail, not another soul in sight. When they returned to the cabin that afternoon, Emily went to grab her phone, but when she checked it, she realized there was no signal. They weren't completely cut off, but the lack of communication with the outside world made everything feel more isolated. That night, after dinner, they decided to play a game to pass the time. As they sat around the table, laughing, Emily felt something cold touch her ankle. She yelped, kicking her foot, but there was nothing there. Sarah, sitting across from her, noticed that Emily's face had drained of color. "What happened?" Sarah asked, but Emily just shook her head. "I swear something touched my ankle." Kevin laughed, brushing it off as a mouse or something, but Emily wasn't convinced. She felt an unease building, like they weren't alone in the cabin. Later that night, when everyone had settled into their rooms, Sarah awoke to the sound of footsteps, soft, deliberate, coming from the hallway outside her door. At first, she thought it was one of her friends, maybe getting up to use the bathroom, but when she checked her phone, she saw that it was nearly 3 a.m. She listened for a moment longer, but the footsteps stopped. She couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. She pulled the covers tightly around her and tried to sleep, but she couldn't. The hairs on the back of her neck stood up, her instincts telling her to get out of bed, to leave the room. The next morning, the group sat around the kitchen table, the awkward tension hanging heavy in the air. No one had gotten much sleep. Emily, now visibly shaken, finally spoke. "I heard something last night. Footsteps. In the hallway, but no one was out there." Sarah froze. "I heard that too." Kevin laughed nervously, though there was no humor in his voice. "It's probably just the house settling or a raccoon or something." But even he couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. The quiet in the cabin was unsettling, almost suffocating. That night, as they all sat in the living room, a loud bang came from upstairs. It echoed through the empty house, followed by a soft, dragging noise, like something heavy was being pulled across the floor. Emily jumped up, her face pale. No, I'm not going up there. Kevin, trying to hold it together, grabbed a flashlight. We'll check it out. It's probably nothing. The others followed him hesitantly, climbing the stairs in silence. The hallway at the top was dark, and as they made their way to the source of the noise, they noticed the air had become cold. It was unnaturally cold, like winter had suddenly descended on them. At the end of the hallway, there was a door, one they hadn't noticed before. It was slightly ajar, and a faint flickering light came from inside. Kevin pushed the door open. What they saw inside froze them in their tracks. The room was bare, except for a single chair in the middle, and there, lying in the chair, was a figure, pale and thin, its head tilted back at an unnatural angle. Its eyes were wide open, staring at the ceiling, but its body was limp, lifeless. The air around it felt wrong, suffocating. As they stood there, a cold chill ran down their spines, and the figure's eyes slowly turned toward them. But it wasn't human. It was something else, something inhuman. Nate slammed the door shut, his heart racing. The group ran back downstairs, their breath shallow, and they gathered in the living room, too scared to speak. Should we leave? Emily whispered, her voice trembling. I don't know if we can, Sarah said, her eyes wide. There's something out there, something in the woods, something waiting. The lights flickered, and suddenly the door to the cabin slammed shut. They were trapped. The next morning, the group managed to leave the cabin, their fear palpable. They didn't talk much as they drove back to civilization, but the unease lingered with them. As they crossed the line back into the nearest town, Kevin checked his phone. It had been dead for days, but as he turned it on, something popped up on his screen. A message, dated from that morning. Don't come back. We're still waiting. They never spoke of that weekend again. But every time they drive through the woods now, they can't shake the feeling that something is still watching them, something waiting for them to return.
Story number 3.
It was supposed to be a weekend getaway. Lisa and her boyfriend Jason had been looking forward to it for weeks. They had rented a cabin deep in the mountains, miles away from the nearest town, to escape the noise of their busy lives. They had no intention of bringing anything but each other, their bags, and a few bottles of wine. It was meant to be peaceful, secluded, just a break from everything. But the peace would not last. The drive up the winding mountain road was long and bumpy, and as the sun began to set, the road got narrower and darker. Lisa was growing nervous. The isolation of the place was beautiful but unsettling, and the trees surrounding them looked like dark sentinels, silent and watching. Jason, always calm, reassured her. It's just a little further. We're almost there. By the time they arrived at the cabin, night had completely fallen. The wooden house looked old but well kept, surrounded by towering trees. The air was thick with the smell of pine, and the sky was clear, revealing a sky full of stars. It was picturesque, but something about the place felt off. As they unpacked, Lisa couldn't shake the feeling that they weren't alone. Every time she stepped outside, she couldn't help but glance over her shoulder, expecting someone or something to be watching her from the trees. Jason, noticing her unease, shrugged it off. You're just imagining things. Let's have a drink and relax. They spent the evening by the fire, laughing and talking. But as the night grew deeper, Lisa began to hear strange noises outside. Rustling in the trees, soft footsteps, almost like someone walking around the cabin. Every time she mentioned it, Jason would assure her it was just animals or the wind, though his tone wasn't as confident as it had been earlier. Later that night, as they were about to turn in for bed, the power went out. The cabin was pitch black, and Lisa's heart raced. Not again, she muttered. They'd had trouble with the power when they first arrived, but Jason had checked the fuse box and fixed it. Now, it was completely dead again. I'll go check the generator, Jason said, grabbing a flashlight. Be careful, Lisa warned, but Jason simply waved her off, stepping outside into the darkness. She waited for what felt like an eternity, but when he didn't return after 10 minutes, her anxiety began to rise. She grabbed her own flashlight and stepped outside, calling his name. Jason? Where are you? The only sound that answered was the wind rustling through the trees. She called again, louder this time. There was no reply. Panic started to set in. Suddenly, she heard a rustling from the woods, and she swung the flashlight in that direction. There, in the distance, she saw him. Jason was standing motionless near the edge of the forest, facing away from her again, as though he hadn't heard her calling. His posture was strange, unnatural, like he was stiff, as if frozen in place. She took a step forward. Jason? She called again, her voice shaky. At the sound of her voice, Jason slowly turned to face her. His eyes were wide, unblinking, but something was horribly wrong. His face was pale, and there was something cold about his expression, as though he wasn't really seeing her. Jason, what's going on? Lisa asked, her voice trembling. He didn't answer. He just stood there, staring at her, a blank look in his eyes. The silence stretched on for what felt like forever. The air was thick with tension. Lisa took a step closer, but Jason suddenly stepped back, shaking his head slowly. You shouldn't have come here, he whispered in a voice that wasn't his own. Lisa froze, her blood running cold. The voice was deep and gravelly, like it had been worn down by years of disuse. It wasn't Jason. It couldn't be. Before she could react, Jason, no, whatever was wearing his body, turned and began walking away, heading deeper into the forest, as if drawn to something invisible. Lisa stood there, paralyzed, watching in horror as he disappeared into the trees. Heart pounding, she rushed back inside, locking the door behind her. Her mind raced. She had to get out of there, but Jason, whatever that was still out there. She grabbed her phone, but there was no signal. The isolation was absolute. She was trapped. Then the knocking started, soft at first, then harder, as if someone or something was impatient to get in. Lisa's stomach churned. She could hear the footsteps again, moving around the house, scraping against the walls, dragging something heavy along the ground. She backed away from the door, holding her breath. The knocking continued, relentless, growing louder, more frantic, and then she heard a voice. A familiar voice. Jason's. Let me in, Lisa. His voice was hoarse, as if it were coming from the depths of a cave. Please, I'm cold. Lisa's heart raced. This wasn't Jason, not anymore. The thing outside knew her name. It knew him. With every ounce of courage she had left, she grabbed the nearest object she could find, a heavy candlestick, and held it in front of her like a weapon. She was ready to fight, to protect herself from whatever had taken Jason. The knocking grew even louder, now accompanied by scratching noises, as if something was trying to dig its way through the walls. Lisa backed away to the farthest corner of the room, clutching the candlestick in a white-knuckled grip. Her mind raced. Was this some kind of twisted game? Was Jason being controlled by something? Or had he become something else entirely? Suddenly, the door burst open. Lisa screamed and swung the candlestick in a blind panic, but there was nothing there. The room was empty. She was alone, except for the sound of the wind in the trees and the faint whisper of a voice in the distance. Lisa? Lisa! She turned around, her pulse pounding. Outside, through the window, she saw a figure standing at the edge of the forest, watching her. Jason's face, pale and lifeless, stared back at her with empty eyes. The figure began to move toward the cabin, slowly, deliberately. And Lisa knew with a terrible certainty that it wasn't Jason anymore. It was something that had taken him. Something that was coming for her next. And the worst part was, there was nowhere to run.
Story number 4.
It had been a long day of hiking, and Sarah and her friend Mike were relieved to finally reach the old, abandoned inn they had booked for the night. It was a rustic place, deep in the forest, built over a century ago. The sun was dipping below the horizon, casting long shadows through the trees, and the air was starting to turn chilly. The inn looked just like it had in the pictures, weathered and full of character, with ivy creeping up the stone walls and a sagging porch that seemed to invite them inside. They were the only ones staying there that night, the innkeeper having mentioned that it had been an unusually slow season. Sarah didn't mind the quiet. She liked the solitude. Mike, however, kept eyeing the dark corners of the place with a hint of unease. Once inside, they unpacked their things and decided to explore the area before it got too dark. The inn was isolated, with no other buildings for miles, surrounded by thick forest. They wandered around the property for a while, laughing at how it felt like something straight out of a horror movie. But as the light began to fade, Sarah noticed something strange. There was a door at the back of the inn that led to a narrow, dark hallway, one they hadn't seen when they first arrived. "Mike, did you see that door when we came in?" she asked, squinting toward the shadowy opening. Mike frowned, a confused look crossing his face. "No, I don't think so. Let's go check it out." They walked down the hallway toward the door, its old wooden surface creaking under their feet. The air in the hallway felt colder than the rest of the inn, and Sarah felt a strange tingle on the back of her neck, as though they were walking into something they shouldn't. Mike reached for the door handle and turned it slowly, the sound of metal scraping against wood echoing in the otherwise silent inn. The door opened into a small, dimly lit room, the only light coming from a single flickering bulb overhead. The room was empty, save for a large, dust-covered mirror on the wall. There was something odd about the reflection, though. It didn't show the two of them standing in front of it, but instead, the reflection showed the room as it had looked decades ago. Aged, decaying, with shadows lingering in every corner. A shiver ran down Sarah's spine. "Mike, I don't think we should be here." But Mike, ever the skeptic, shrugged it off. "It's just a mirror, probably a relic from the old days." They turned to leave, but as they did, Sarah caught a glimpse of movement in the reflection, something in the corner of the room, a figure. She froze, staring at the mirror, her heart thumping in her chest. The figure in the reflection was a woman, standing motionless with long, tangled hair, her face obscured by shadows. Her presence felt suffocating, like she was watching them with an intensity that made the air thick with tension. "Mike?" Sarah whispered urgently, grabbing his arm. "Do you see that?" Mike turned back, and his face went pale as he saw the reflection too. That wasn't there before," he said, his voice trembling. The air in the room seemed to grow colder. They both stepped backward, a sense of dread creeping up their spines. The woman in the reflection began to move slowly, her head tilting to one side as if studying them. Then, without warning, the bulb overhead flickered and went out, plunging the room into total darkness. Sarah felt Mike's hand grab hers. "Let's go. Now." But as they turned to leave, the door slammed shut with a deafening bang. The room was suddenly pitch black, and they could hear breathing, slow, uneven, right behind them. A hot breath brushed across Sarah's neck, making her gasp. "Mike," she whispered, her voice shaking. "Mike, do you hear that?" "I hear it," he replied, his voice barely audible. His hand gripped hers harder. "We need to get out of here now." The door wouldn't open. Mike tugged at the handle, but it refused to budge. The breathing grew louder, more erratic, until it sounded like it was all around them. The temperature dropped, and Sarah's breath formed clouds in the air. And then, just as suddenly as it had started, the door flew open, and the hallway light flickered back to life. They didn't hesitate. They bolted from the room, out of the narrow hallway, and into the main part of the inn. But the feeling of being watched didn't go away. It lingered, like a shadow that clung to them, and neither of them dared to speak as they hurried back to their room. They locked the door behind them and sat in silence, the weight of what they had just experienced pressing down on them. Hours passed, and neither of them slept. Sarah couldn't shake the image of the woman in the mirror, her cold, hollow eyes staring at them, unblinking. Around 2 a.m., Sarah was woken by a strange noise, the sound of footsteps in the hallway outside their door. She sat up in bed, heart pounding, and looked over at Mike. He was still asleep, oblivious to the sound that was growing louder. The footsteps were slow and deliberate, as if someone or something was pacing outside their room, waiting. Suddenly, the door handle rattled. The hairs on the back of Sarah's neck stood up, and she held her breath, straining to hear. There was no one there, but the footsteps continued, moving back and forth in front of their door. Then, the unmistakable sound of a low guttural whisper filled the room, coming from just beyond the door. "Get out! Get out! You shouldn't be here!" The whisper was followed by a loud bang, like something heavy had struck the door. Sarah's blood ran cold. She slowly reached for her phone, dialing the innkeeper's number, but there was no signal. Her fingers trembled as she tried again. Nothing. The whispering continued, growing louder, more insistent. "Get out!" But Sarah didn't need to hear it again. She knew they couldn't stay here anymore. Without saying a word to Mike, she grabbed her things and ran out of the room. The hall was empty, but the air felt thick, like something was pressing down on her chest. She hurried down the stairs and out of the inn, Mike finally waking up and stumbling behind her. They didn't stop until they reached their car. As they drove away, Sarah glanced in the rearview mirror, expecting to see the inn in the distance. But instead, she saw the reflection of a woman standing in the doorway, watching them drive away, her face still hidden in shadow. Neither of them ever spoke of what happened that night again, but the memory of the woman in the mirror stayed with them. And every time they passed through the woods, they couldn't shake the feeling that they were being followed, watched by something that had never left the inn.
Story number 5.
It was supposed to be the perfect summer vacation. Claire and her friends, Jake, Emily, and Ben, had rented a small beach house along the coast, hoping to enjoy a few days of sun, swimming, and relaxation. The house was located at the very edge of a quiet, secluded beach, far away from any crowds or noise. The sand stretched out endlessly in front of them, and the sound of the waves crashing against the shore was the only thing that could be heard in the stillness. When they arrived, the weather was beautiful, the sun was warm, and everything seemed perfect. They spent the first day lounging on the beach, swimming in the crystal clear water, and joking around in the warmth of the afternoon sun. But as the sun began to set, Claire noticed something strange. The beach had a peculiar, eerie stillness to it. There were no boats on the horizon, no seagulls calling, and no sign of life anywhere. It felt almost forgotten. Emily and Jake joked about how isolated the house was, but Claire couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. She dismissed it, telling herself it was just the unfamiliarity of being so far away from everything. That night, after a dinner of grilled seafood, they decided to take a walk along the beach under the stars. The air had turned cooler, and a light mist hung over the ocean, making the night feel more mysterious. As they walked, Claire found herself trailing behind the others, mesmerized by the way the moonlight shimmered on the water. Then she heard something, a soft, low voice calling her name. She stopped, looking around, but saw no one. She thought it was just the wind, or perhaps her imagination, but the voice sounded so real. The others hadn't heard it, so she didn't say anything. She shook it off and continued walking, trying to keep up with the group. But the feeling of unease never quite left her. Later that night, after they had returned to the house, the strange sensation grew stronger. Claire went to bed early, hoping to shake the feeling, but as she lay in the dark, she could hear something, soft scratching noises coming from the window. It was quiet at first, just a faint scrape, like something or someone was slowly running their fingernails across the glass. Claire held her breath, staring at the window, but there was nothing outside. No animals, no wind, just the sound of the waves crashing far in the distance. She tried to ignore it, but the scratching continued, growing louder, until it sounded like nails being dragged down the glass in long, agonizing strokes. Claire felt her pulse quicken. She couldn't take it anymore. She jumped out of bed, grabbed her phone, and rushed outside to find the others. "Jake, Emily, Ben," she called, but no one responded. The house was eerily silent, the only sound being the whisper of the ocean. She stepped out into the moonlight, her feet sinking into the soft sand. The mist had thickened, obscuring her view. In the distance, she could make out the faint silhouette of the beach house, but it looked wrong, as if the light was warping around it, casting long, twisted shadows. Claire's phone buzzed, startling her. It was a message from Ben, but the words made her stomach drop. "Don't come back to the house. We're not alone." Panic surged through her. She dialed Ben's number, but it went straight to voicemail. She tried Jake's and Emily's phones, but they were all disconnected. A cold chill crept up her spine as the hairs on the back of her neck stood up. The house loomed ahead of her, twisted and distorted in the mist. She heard footsteps behind her, slow and deliberate. Her heart raced as she spun around, but no one was there. The footsteps stopped. Claire began to run toward the house, her breath coming in short gasps. The moment she reached the porch, she heard the soft whisper again. This time it was much clearer. "Claire, you shouldn't have come." She froze, her breath catching in her throat. The voice was coming from inside the house. It was her friends, but the tone was wrong, cold, distant, and distorted. She pushed open the door, stepping inside, and the air felt heavy, thick with something that wasn't right. The house was dark, the only light coming from a few flickering candles scattered around the living room. As her eyes adjusted, she could make out the figures of her friends sitting motionless in the corners, their faces pale, their eyes wide open but lifeless. "Ben? Emily? Jake?" Claire whispered, her voice trembling. The figure of Ben stirred, his head slowly tilting toward her. He smiled, but it wasn't a normal smile. It was too wide, too forced, like something had taken over his body. His voice came next, but it wasn't his voice. It was a deep, rasping whisper, like it had been pulled from somewhere far below the earth. "You shouldn't have come," he said, his voice unnatural. "This place, it never lets anyone leave." Claire took a step back, her mind racing. She turned to run, but as she did, the door slammed shut with a deafening bang. The room was now completely dark, save for the flickering candles that cast distorted shadows across the walls. From the corners of the room, the others began to move. Their bodies jerked and twitched as if they were being controlled by something unseen. Their faces remained expressionless, but their mouths began to open in unison, chanting something in a language Claire couldn't understand. The floor beneath her began to tremble, and she could feel the air growing thicker, suffocating her. She ran toward the door again, pulling desperately on the handle, but it wouldn't budge. Behind her, the chanting grew louder, more insistent, as the figures of her friends closed in on her, their eyes now glowing a faint, unnatural red. Claire turned around, and that's when she saw it, the shape in the corner of the room. It was tall, skeletal, with skin that looked like old, decaying leather. Its eyes were black, hollow, and it was watching her. Slowly, it raised its hand, pointing at her. "You shouldn't have come," it whispered. Claire screamed, but her voice was drowned out by the sound of the wind howling through the cracks in the house. The last thing she saw before everything went dark was the figure slowly stepping toward her. Its eyes locked onto hers, and the chilling, inescapable realization that she would never leave. The next morning, the beach house was empty. No one knew what happened to Claire or her friends. The only thing they found was a series of strange, twisted symbols scratched into the sand near the shore, forming a circle that no one could explain. The locals say the house is cursed, and that once you enter, you can never leave. Every now and then, a visitor will hear strange whispers when they walk past, and if you listen closely, you might just hear Claire's voice, calling from the shadows. "Don't come back. It's too late."
Story number 6.
It was supposed to be a quiet road trip through the countryside, a simple getaway for Sam and his wife, Rachel, to clear their minds and take in the sights. They had decided on a route that would take them through the back roads, away from the busy highways, for a more peaceful, scenic drive. The sun was setting, casting an orange glow over the fields as they cruised through small towns and empty stretches of farmland. Everything felt serene at first. Just the hum of the car, the occasional chirp of insects outside, and the wide open spaces. But as the hours passed, the roads became narrower, more isolated. The small towns began to fade into the distance, and the land around them grew darker, more desolate. At one point, they passed a rundown gas station with flickering lights, but no one was there. They didn't stop. The GPS had gone out about 20 minutes ago, but Rachel didn't mind. She trusted Sam to find their way. Still, as they drove further, Rachel began to feel uneasy. She couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong, that they were driving deeper into an unknown, hidden part of the world. The trees on either side of the road grew dense, their branches twisting like gnarled fingers, blocking out the light of the fading sun. "Sam," Rachel said quietly, her voice tight, "I don't think we should keep going." Sam glanced at her a little concerned. "What do you mean?" "I don't know. It just feels off. Are we sure we're on the right road?" Sam frowned, glancing at the empty highway in front of them. "We're fine. There's nothing out here. It's just the countryside. We'll be fine." But Rachel couldn't shake the nagging feeling that something was watching them, something unseen, something lurking just beyond the trees. They pressed on, hoping the feeling would pass, but it didn't. If anything, it grew stronger. The road was now surrounded by nothing but dense forest, and they hadn't passed another car in what felt like hours. The headlights of their car barely pierced the darkness in front of them. Then, out of nowhere, the car sputtered and stalled. Sam tried the ignition again, but the engine just made a weak clicking noise and refused to start. He muttered under his breath and tried again. Nothing. "Are you kidding me?" Sam muttered, frustrated. He popped the hood of the car, getting out to inspect the engine. Rachel stayed in the car, throughout her hands trembling as she looked out into the night. The air was thick with silence. No animals, no wind, just an oppressive stillness. As Sam checked under the hood, Rachel's eyes scanned the dark woods surrounding them, and that's when she saw it, a figure standing in the trees. At first she thought it was just a trick of the shadows, but as she squinted, she realized that the figure was tall and thin, almost impossibly so. It stood motionless, just beyond the reach of the headlights, its body blending into the darkness. "Sam," Rachel called out, her voice strained. "Sam, there's someone out there." Sam didn't hear her at first, still fiddling with the engine. She called out again, her voice rising in panic. "Sam, there's someone in the trees." Finally, Sam turned and saw the figure. He straightened, looking confused. "What the hell?" He started walking toward the figure, but Rachel grabbed his arm. "Don't! Sam, something's wrong. We need to get out of here now." But it was too late. The figure in the woods didn't move at first, just stood there staring at them. Then, slowly, it took a step forward. Rachel's heart raced. "Sam, get in the car. We have to go." Sam hesitated, but then something in his expression shifted. It was like he had recognized something in the figure that Rachel couldn't see, something that made him take another step forward. "Sam, no!" Rachel screamed. Before she could reach him, the figure moved. It was swift, unnatural in its motion, like it was gliding rather than walking. Sam didn't even have time to react as the figure reached him, its long, twisted arms wrapping around his body in a violent, jerking motion. Rachel screamed, but the sound was swallowed by the heavy silence of the woods. Her legs froze as she watched Sam struggle, his body going limp in the figure's grip. He was pulled into the darkness, vanishing without a trace. No sound followed, just an eerie, suffocating quiet. Rachel's blood ran cold. She stumbled backward, her mind screaming at her to run, but she couldn't move. Then a voice, low, guttural, and impossibly close, whispered from the shadows. "She's next." Rachel bolted into the car, slamming the door behind her, her hands shaking as she tried to start the engine again. This time it turned over, the engine sputtering to life. The car roared forward, tires screeching as she sped down the road. The forest seemed to close in on her as she drove faster and faster, but no matter how much she pushed the car, it felt like the road never ended. There was only darkness ahead, an endless stretch of trees and shadows. Then, through the rearview mirror, she saw something that made her blood freeze. The figure was standing in the middle of the road, watching her drive toward it, unmoving, unfazed by the headlights. Rachel slammed on the brakes, but it didn't matter. The car swerved, tires screeching, and then nothing. Her vision blurred, the world around her spinning. She was falling. When Rachel woke up, she was lying on the cold, hard ground. The car was nowhere to be seen. The forest had closed in around her, the trees thick with darkness. But the figure was there. It stood in front of her, motionless, its pale eyes glinting in the shadows. And the whispers started again, low and insistent. "You shouldn't have come. Now you're part of it." Rachel's breath quickened as she scrambled to her feet, looking around in desperation. But there was nowhere to go. The forest stretched endlessly in every direction, dark and suffocating. The figure took a step closer, its long, bony fingers reaching toward her. And then Rachel understood. There was no escape. The forest had claimed them both. No one ever found Sam or Rachel. The car was found abandoned on the side of the road a few days later, but the woods remained silent. Locals say that the forest has a way of pulling people in, trapping them forever. Some claim to hear whispers when they walk through, urging them to stay, to never leave. And if you're unlucky enough to drive down those roads, the last thing you'll see before the darkness swallows you whole is a tall, thin figure waiting for its next victim.